coming in very late due to technical difficulties. We are 15 minutes late, and we profusely apologize for that. We hope the other people who may have left early join us again in the next few minutes. We have several clarifications to make. We are also adjusting to this Friday forum because we usually have it on Saturday. But due to unforeseen circumstances, we have to move it to Friday today. Therefore, Madam Ana Malindogoy, Professor Ana Malindogoy, is unable to join us, unable to adjust her weekday schedule for her from her scholarship studies. So, but now I turn you over to our regular moderator, Danny Long, who will also make some clarifications. Danny?
All right, good morning, everyone, to our live audience on Facebook, YouTube, and everyone who will be watching us in the replay afterwards. My name is Daniel Long. I'm the regular moderator here for Asian Century Philippine Strategic Studies Forums, and I am one of the Philippine press delegates to China and a writer for Asian Century Journal. We have three teams for today: DFA Must Prevail, PCG, Coast Guard Hawks, imperialism versus U.S. imperialism, and economic development before militarist expansion. We have three speakers today, including myself. I will be delivering a presentation on Philippines-Russia relations at the end. But first, I'd like to introduce Mr. Herman Laurel, President of Asian Century Philippines Strategic Studies Institute, to give his opening statement. And of course, again, to our audience, I apologize for us being late a few minutes, couple of minutes due to unforeseen circumstances. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, kasamang Danny. We will be speaking in English because I have been informed by several embassies, particularly ASEAN embassies, that they are monitoring our discussions and they have requested that we speak or present our presentations in English so they can follow the details. But of course, we cannot avoid using Taglish sometimes as we go through and explain these issues. But the past 2 months, at least since, and even a bit back in December 2023, have noticed a calming down of the waters around the Ayungin Shoal or Renai Reef, as China calls it, or in English, Second Thomas Shoal. This has been due to fundamental decisions made by our Philippine government, our Department of Foreign Affairs, and cryptically, which we will explain today, from the Office of the President. I will now present my paper, which is entitled DFA Must Prevail Over the Philippine Coast Guard Hawks. Because as I started explaining, there has been a calming effect of certain decisions of the Department of Foreign Affairs in the relationship between the Philippines and China. However, this has not been met with equanimity. This has not been met with acceptance by the hawkish elements of the what I call national police and security establishment of the Philippines. Now, let me start with my first image, my first slide for today's presentation. While I read, you can peruse the image while I read some parts of my paper today, of our paper. Yeah, there is a conflict brewing between the Department of Foreign Affairs, the foreign policy implementing department of the Philippine government, who reports directly to the President of the Philippines, and elements of the National Police, particularly the Maritime Police, and the National Security Council, and the Armed Forces of the Philippines. The conflict arises from the insubordination of elements of the national police and security establishment against the recent paradigm shift ordered by the President of the Republic to the DFA, Department of Foreign Affairs, to resume dialogue on issues and controversies and de-escalate tensions over the South China Sea claims between the Philippines and China. On December 2023, multiple media outlets reported the insubordination of on December 2023, President Marcos was quoted by multiple Philippine media sources as calling for a paradigm shift. Direct quote, headline, this is one of the headlines, paradigm shift needed for West Philippine Sea issue dash PBBM, unquote. Calling for that change in the approach to the West Philippine Sea that will, quote again, take us down not the road to conflict, but down the road to peace. That is a direct quote from the President, from several news reports, including the Philippine National News Agency, PNA. However, on February 13, 2024, this year, multiple media outlets again reported the insubordination of the National Task Force West Philippine Sea spokesman Commodore J. Tariela, who said, as a GMA News headline put it, quote, transparency strategy in the West Philippine Sea will continue despite de-escalation deal with China, unquote. Now, note that he also recognizes that there is a deal, there exists a deal between the Philippines and China to de-escalate tensions. And as we have shown you, this is based on initially cryptic but now very clear instruction from Malacanang, the architect of the chief architect of Philippine foreign policy. This statement of Tariela directly contravenes the intention of the quote-unquote paradigm shift instructed by the President and carried out by the Department of Foreign Affairs. Now, let us illustrate first the 8th bilateral consultation mechanism that followed the announcement of President Bongbong Marcos of the paradigm shift. Next slide, please. Yes. So there was a formal meeting of the Department of Foreign Affairs with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China. And this is the Department of Foreign Affairs readout of that meeting, of that announcement. A statement on the 8th Philippine-China bilateral mechanism on the South China Sea, and so on and so forth. So this is evidence that the discussions occurred, and as even admitted by the Hawk, Ariela, a deal was made to de-escalate. So we show, next slide, the insubordination of Commodore J. Tariela. Can we show that? From GMA News Online as well as other news agencies. Transparency strategy in the West Philippine Sea will continue despite the escalation deal with China, says Philippine Coast Guard's Tariela. This is a direct contravention of what the Department of Foreign Affairs has instructed by Malacanang to be doing to de-escalate, because the strategy, the transparency strategy, is part of the strategy of tension designed, crafted by the United States of America Naval Intelligence. We will elaborate on that. So now let us expose again for the nth time the transparency strategy. The transparency strategy that the Philippine Coast Guard National Task Force on West Philippine Sea spokesman Commodore J. Tariela is now claiming to be a Philippine government strategy is actually the plan of ex-U.S. Air Force Colonel Raymond Powell of the United States Naval Research Office Gordian Knot Center for National Security Innovations that has been called the MUSU project to the aim of which is, quote, exact reputational cost, unquote, on China through, quote again, assertive transparency, unquote. This is the next slide that shows this is from the U.S. Naval Institute. They have the Project MUSU, and under Project MUSU, and the team leader of Project MUSU is Raymond Powell, Colonel Raymond Powell. You will see more of him in a while. There is also the operation lighting up sea light. It's called sea light, to light up so-called maritime gray zone. As an independent civil society-led initiative, Project MUSU supports U.S. goal, not Philippine goal, to expose and deter China's gray zone activities through application of what Powell calls assertive transparency. MUSU helps counter the asymmetric advantage of China. So inherent in that line is the admission by even the United States Naval Intelligence that China enjoys asymmetric advantage in this theater of operation of the Americans. And this, I will read further. The MUSU project was presented by the Strap-based Albert Del Rosario Institute in January 2023 and imposed on President Marcos Jr. in February 2023 upon his return from his state visit to China. We have more details about that. Reported threats from ex-General Carlito Galvez and the ex-General, now National Security Council Director General, if I'm not mistaken about the name of the title, Eduardo Año, threatening a coup against President Marcos if this was not implemented. Now we say clearly it is reportedly because we also have to transmit this report to the public and request the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and other relevant committees to take note of this and call for an investigation of these reports. So it was presented to the Strat-based Albert Del Rosario Institute in January. In February, upon his return from his state visit to China, he was pressured to approve all this, including, of course, the well-known approval for the additional U.S. EDCA bases. Shortly thereafter, deliberate challenges to China's exercise of sovereignty by the Philippine Coast Guard started, and these continued to December 2023. This proved to be of no avail, however, as the Philippine Coast Guard could not break China's blockade of construction materials delivery to the Ayungin Shoal stranded vessel BRP Sierra Madre. On February 7, 2024, Tariela was headlined to say, look at this, transparency efforts not enough to compel China to obey, unquote, obey what? International law as interpreted by Tariela, or the arbitration award that even the United Nations said it does not recognize. In other words, the U.S. Naval Intelligence Project MUSU has proven a complete failure after a year of operation. Hence, the Department of Foreign Affairs resumed its serious dialogue with China. Wala po, bokya po ang Amerikano sa kanilang assertive transparency. Walang nagbago, lumala lang po ang sitwasyon ng Republic of the Philippines vis-a-vis People's Republic of China. The resumption of dialogue with China, which happened during the 8th bilateral consultation mechanism talks, has restored the calm and peaceful resupply missions of humanitarian provisions to the BRP Sierra Madre and rotation of troops. But the U.S. plan to set up the combined forward operating base Sierra Madre has once again become a dream that is too far difficult to achieve, because the United States has announced that it intends to convert BRP Sierra Madre to a combined forward operating base for American intervention in the region. So, the admission of failure, we hear from Tariela himself, the mouthpiece of Raymond Powell in the Philippines. Now, we will present to you the undisguised U.S. interference in the Philippines, which mainstream media seems to just accept and allow, which so-called patriotic senators do not protest, except for a few. I think Senator Amy Marcos is one of them, and probably the only one who has aggressively denounced this intervention and interference of the Americans in the affairs, internal affairs, and foreign affairs of the Republic of the Philippines. And we will show the temerity of the U.S. in doing this. The temerity of U.S. military intelligence, if we can now present the first slide in this segment. The temerity of U.S. military intelligence forces to interfere in domestic Philippine affairs is a sight to behold. You know, right in front of everybody's nose. Shamelessly, it is accepted by senators, congressmen, civil society leaders, media people. Project Mushu team leader Colonel Raymond Powell is an, quote, in your face, unquote, presence, belligerent in the Philippines, lording it over in tri-media, in the programs 24/7, 24-hour days, 7 days a week, in ANC, 24 Horas, the TV talk show, and other broadcast networks and newspaper interviews and panel talks. And this interference is shamelessly accepted by so many in Philippine media. Hindi ba kayo nahiya? Wala ba kayong sense of history kung anong ginawa at ginagawa ng Amerikano dito sa Pilipinas? Malacanang, wala ba kayong hiya na inyong ama ay kinidnap ng mga Amerikano? Na basta-basta na lang po ngayon kalaro po ninyo dito sa politika po nyo. Despite the obvious failure of shaming China and, quote, gathering international support against China, unquote, Raymond Powell claims his project has complicated things for China. But really, it is the Philippines that is suffering from the loss of Chinese investments and infrastructure building assistance, thus setting back, quote, build better more, unquote, by years and years. Our wiser ASEAN neighbors have kept a far distance away from this provocative stance of the Philippines. So what international support is this Project Mushu gaining for the Philippines? It is complicating things for the Philippines. Even as the DFA de-escalates, it is publicly contradicted by alien American Raymond Powell, who is announcing in international, social, and Philippine media the, quote, institutionalization, unquote, of the strategy of, quote again, assertive transparency, unquote, that is reiterated robotically by the Philippine Coast Guard's Tariela and buttressed by the Philippine Defense Secretary with his announcement of troop increases to the Batanes Island that is facing Taiwan and the Bashi Straits. Interfering brazenly in the affairs of the region, Raymond Powell tells the ANC audience that the ASEAN is useless in the South China Sea issues, but he advises the Philippines not to bring the West Philippine Sea issue to the United Nations, as it would lose its case there. This contradicts the calls of the staunch West Philippine Sea arbitration advocate Justice Antonio Carpio and Senator Risa Hontiveros to bring the matter to the UN General Assembly. But let me reiterate, even the Americans know the West Philippine Sea issue does not have the legitimacy to even get it to the first base of UN General Assembly discussions. Tariela and Raymond Powell want the, quote, transparency strategy, unquote, to continue in 2024. Their actions are what Einstein said about about insanity. Quote, insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Unquote. A continuation of the transparency strategy benefits only the Americans who want to sour Philippine-China relations and ASEAN centrality and restore a chance for U.S. hegemony to return. Now, let us go into the revival of the Philippine-China dialogue. Why and what? For 24 years prior to 2023, the Philippine-China dialogue went smoothly. Only a handful of tense incidents occurred over 8,500 days from 1999 to 2022. 8,500 days, you can count on your one hand the fingers of one hand, the incidents that really became controversial. There was only one moment in 2016 that caused momentary intensification of tensions. This was still used up to this day as basis for contesting the sovereign claim of China. As we have shown over and over again, the arbitral awards decision was a questionable process from the very beginning. Okay, let's show because since July 2016, in an interview with Ambassador, I think once Ambassador to the United Nations of the Philippines, Rosario Manalo. Rosario Manalo, we can show the video if we have time, but I will just report to you what she said. She said, I am no traitor. But no matter how hard I think about it, China did not participate in the arbitration discussions or negotiations or whatever it's called. And you cannot compel a party that is not present in the process to comply. If you need to watch the entire video, it's on the internet. And you can just inquire and email us and we can send it to you. Now let's move on to the 8th bilateral consultation mechanism. It met in January of 2024, putting things back on track. This came after a December 2023 phone conversation between the Chinese State and Foreign Minister Wang Yi. And during that conversation, Wang Yi advised Philippine Foreign Secretary Enrique Manalo that the 2023 troubles between China and the Philippines has been caused solely by the Philippines' deviation from established agreements. So what China was saying there is, we did not change anything. We did not do anything to cause a sudden deterioration of relations over the Ayungin Shoal or Renai Reef or Second Thomas Shoal. You changed your position, which is so obvious. And it could not even be denied by our Department of Foreign Affairs. In that phone conversation on December 20, Wang Yi warned the Philippines that relations with China is at the crossroad, that the latter must, quote, act with caution, unquote, and, quote again, return to the right path, unquote. It was the moment, the only moment that China took a very, very strong stand against what the Philippines was doing in the disputed areas of the South China Sea. Early on in the 2023 controversy, China had renewed its offer to meet halfway, courtesy of Ambassador Huang Xilian of the Embassy of China in Manila. And in January 2024, after a few weeks of calm in the disputed areas of the South China Sea between China and the Philippines, China revived its proposal for the joint oil and gas exploration project that could quickly reverse the dire economic situation of the Philippines if it proceeds post-haste. President Duterte reminded the nation in April 2022. You see the offer of China. This is dated. This is dated August 11, 2023. There is a January report on this. I'm sorry, I was not able to put on the correct news item. Now, next slide. President Duterte reminded the nation, the Filipino people, in April of 2020 through the media, that the commitment to proceed with the joint oil-gas deal should be honored. His reminder was sabotaged by elements in the network of the Forum Energy, which administered by Manny Pangilinan, and the struck-based ADRI group, namely then Foreign Affairs Secretary Teodoro Locsin, who admitted in his own words that he had unilaterally terminated the deal. This is Duterte's announcement. So we finally come to the last segment of our position paper. So we have established that the plan, so-called assertive transparency, is an American plan implemented by American operators in the Philippines. We will call American boys or amboys like Tariela. We have explained that even the Americans and Tariela himself admits that the assertive transparency strategy has not succeeded. It has not delivered what it promises and promised, such as making China pay a cost in reputation, making the international community support the Philippines when actually the ASEAN is staying away from this strategy. And it has brought about many complications for the Philippines, including the collapse of the infrastructure programs of the Republic of the Philippines. Why do we say this? The report has just come out that Senator Amy Marcos has discovered that there is zero infrastructure budget for the year 2024. Am I correct? 2024. Zero for infrastructure. Alam po ba ninyo kung anong ibig sabihin niyan, mga kabansang Pilipino? Wala pong budget para sa karagdagang tulay, karagdagang mga ports or puerta, karagdagang airport. So, is the mainstream media reporting this accurately? What we have seen so far with the administration is not build better more, but cancel more and more all the infrastructure projects and programs, cancelando ang Mindanao Railroad, kanselado ang North Railway, kanselado ang Bicol Express Reconstruction, ah, suspendido ang Phase 2 ng Chico River Irrigation Pump Project, and so on and so forth. So we must shut up this Philippine Coast Guard hawk, Ariela and company. We must shut the hell up this Ibo Teodoro Defense Secretary. And we must shut up this Raymond Powell alien interloper. Where in the world can one see a policy issuance by a cabinet-ranked department being contradicted, overridden, and overruled by a mere maritime police agency? Ariela has made public claims that the transparency strategy is a Philippine government policy. Where is this written down in the National Security Policy 2023 to 2028? Where is it? Show us that it is stated there. It is time someone in the Senate investigate all these questions. The transparency strategy has been debunked by empirical facts. It does not work. It has not compelled China to relent on its exercise of sovereignty over its claimed sea territory. This despite almost a whole year of challenges and provocations of the Philippine Coast Guard, including the attempt to use civilians to bait the Chinese Coast Guard into committing errors and violations which the latter has not been baited into. Okay. China has not suffered any reputational costs. In fact, it has enhanced its reputation for professionalism and safely thwarted the American strategy of using provocations to broadcast alleged abuse. Instead, the international observers are witness to the violations of collision regulations by the Philippine Coast Guard hired vessels trying to bait the Chinese Coast Guard into a serious collision. The Department of Defense sharing 60% for the Philippines. Just to highlight again the attitude that Manuel Pangilinan and Forum Energy really has over the South China Sea. Claims, let us again flash, Joshua. The offer of Manuel Pangilinan to China to exchange Spratlys for the Reed Bank. That is that kind of attitude that this Manuel Pangilinan has towards Philippine national interest. There is no such thing for Manny Pangilinan about national interest. It is only his Forum Energy, Salim Group's interest in controlling the oil and gas resources of the Reed Bank and of the South China Sea disputed areas. We have to put stress on that because Manny Pangilinan controls Inquirer, Philippine Star, TV5, and I don't know what other media groups. They will never report this to the people. They create the boogeyman of China to divert from the true voracious, avaricious party. That is Manny Pangalinan's group, Forum Energy, Salim Group, and the Western Financial Mafia. The legal impediments have been created by the legal representatives of the Philippines to these talks itself, such as Eddie Boy Locsin, because there are many ways to skin the cat, because the Philippine Constitution's preamble puts as paramount the national interest, puts as paramount the welfare of the people. And you can have a treaty to tap and exploit these natural gas and oil resources of the Reed Bank or the Spratlys or anywhere else with China. A treaty becomes part of the national law. Our colleague Ado Paglinawan has taken the example of Timor-Leste in a condominium arrangement with the government of Australia and Indonesia to jointly tap the oil and gas resources of the Timor Sea, if I'm not mistaken, it's called. So there are many ways to skin the cat because it's a question of cuarta or cajon. My colleague, our colleague Rod Kapunan has written recently in his column in Manila Standard, cuarta or cajon. The oil and natural gas deal with China is already cuarta, money, almost in hand. While the West Philippine Sea claim is cajon. What is inside? You think you will get something there? That is zero chance with China's gargantuan resources to establish its sovereignty over the area. So, for so many years now, Manny Pangilinan, Justice Carpio, and their mouthpieces, writers, their hired pens, Javad Haydarian, their scholars like Batong Bakal have been saying, we want the cajon, we want the cajon, we want the cajon. There is nothing inside the cajon. So, now let us go back and summarize again. The Department of Foreign Affairs, under the instruction of President Bongbong Marcos, has taken the right track. That is a paradigm shift back to the original dialogue that has persisted for 24 years without trouble, and resume the dialogue and cooperation with China, and post haste proceed to agree with China on the joint exploration and exploitation of the Reed Bank or Recto Bank natural gas and oil, so that the Filipino people may enjoy the material benefits immediately following the advice of the late President Deng Xiaoping when President Corazon C. Aquino visited Deng Xiaoping in the 80s. Set aside the disputes and let us jointly share the bounties of our shared resources. So with that, I end our position paper presentation this morning, and we will proceed to the presentations of Ado Paglinawan and Danny Long. But if there are any questions, Joshua, can you check? Our media friends have just started arriving because, but anyway, other questions can be raised later on.
Please send your questions to Zoom or in Facebook or in the YouTube comments so we may get through all of them.
Okay, so we'll just wait for questions later on, which we can respond to.
All right.
Let us invite Kaado to join us now.
Thank you, Kamentong, for that great presentation and reminding us that sorry for that. That we must pursue economic development rather than military expansion. And we hope that Malacanang and the president quickly discipline these insubordinates who are hijacking his foreign policy and those who are trying to strangle ASEAN and Asian centrality. Again, please send your questions to Facebook and YouTube. We'll try to get through all of them later on. Also, if you're joining the Zoom, please send your questions there. We'll try to read them. Let us now welcome Kaado Paglinawan, Vice President of Asian Century Philippine Strategic Studies Institute. He is also the host of Ang Maestro, a show on the Katipunan channel, Unfinished Revolution on Global Talk News Radio. Let's welcome Kaado Paglinawan for his opening statements.
Good morning to all of you. This is our first forum for Dragon Year. And before I go to my main topic, I'd just like to say a few words about the loose cannon that has been the Manila Times reported that Raymond Powell is on a PR bleach. And why not? With the failure of Project Mushu and the assertive transparency effort, he definitely will lose his job. And much needed funds for his show and tell in the South China Seas. But he made some comments to the Manila Times. He said the project achievements were it strengthened the Philippines' national resilience. Yung po mga boda bill nila dyan sa South China Seas, which was really in departure of existing protocols from the 7th bilateral consultative meeting with China. Umalis sila sa protocol, hindi na nila kinakausap ang Coast Guard ng China. Basta na lang sila papasok. Number one, alam nila that China is in possession of the territory. Number two, the reason why they were not observing protocol became obvious later because they were not only bringing humanitarian needs for the Marine stationed at BRP Sierra Madre at Tayungin Shoal, they were also delivering construction and building materials in violation of agreements earlier set. So I don't know what Raymond Powell meant by strengthening the Philippine national resilience. I think this is a lot of BS. What national resilience are you talking about? The project seeks to develop tools to counter Beijing's gray zone tactics in the South China Sea. After 10.5 months, what the world saw were not any counter to Beijing's law enforcement activities in the South China Sea. What the world saw was the resoluteness of China in protecting its red lines when it comes to sovereignty. Number two, the absence of a false flag in 10.5 months of provocations, despite the numerous departure of the Philippine side from existing protocols, did not produce a single false flag, which demonstrated to the world that it is China that is conducting itself professionally and responsibly in the South China Sea, and that it can enforce its presence in the area. So, ewan ko, in the first place, there is already an anomaly. Why are we hiring a former Air Force colonel, an American at that, who hides behind the Gordian Knot Institute for whatever, when actually he's working for the U.S. Naval Institute? This guy is a spy. Ang daming cover. And we're hiring him, or the Americans is hiring him to protect our sovereignty? And you call that heroism? Second, sabi ni Raymond Powell, the international support it generated gives the country the moral and material leverage against China. You're an idiot, Raymond Powell. Only 25, kasama na US, kasama yung lahat ng Euro countries. Out of 194? What international support are you talking about? Finally, it imposes reputational costs against Beijing to force a change in its behavior based on risks. Magbasa ka, Powell. Kayo sa DND, kayo sa DFA, kayo sa PCG, kayo sa NSA, basahin ninyo ang red lines ng China. China will not move an inch on those red lines unless through bilateral negotiations. Isn't it obvious to you at this point that sovereign rights cannot protrude any claims for sovereignty? But it can, under only one possibility. If the sovereign allows you to enjoy your sovereign rights. But if the sovereign does not allow you and has all the Coast Guard and the People's Liberation Army with its Navy, submarines, and the biggest Navy in the world, its Air Force, and its Dongfeng missiles to support it, Let's see. Sabi ko nga, in an interview the other day, dahil pinapasok yung Teresa Magbanwa doon sa Scarborough Shoal. And then Raymond Powell, nung sinita yung Teresa Magbanwa, Jay Tariela was saying that China, by doing that, was violating international law. Unang-una, Tariela, PCG, Teresa Magbanwa, is not a fishing vessel. It is not part of the arbitral ruling exception for fishermen of some nationalities to do fishing in the Scarborough Shoal. Obvious naman siguro yun sa'yo, di ba? You belong to that organization eh. Kakahiya ka naman. No? Pangit-pangit mo na. Lumalabas pa sa bibig mo, kabalintunan. Pangalawa, noong 2012, isinurrender natin yung area yan sa China. So China is in control. What are you talking about? That China is in violation of international law. Palibasa, sa Japan ka nag-aral, kaya baka hindi ka naman marunong magnipongo, hindi mo na intindihan yung lesson. Hello? Sabi ni Powell, I do think China is looking at changing its tactics. He sees the assertive transparency as in the same spectrum of the activities in the 2016 Arbitral Tribunal ruling. Oh, therefore, we are changing your name to Raymond Powell to you have just thrown in the towel, Raymond Towel. Wala na mangyayari dyan. Mag-invento ka uli ng ibang project. Kasi yung museum mo, tapos na yan. At kung ipipilit nyo pa yan, mamaya, di-discuss ko yung rating ng ating Pangulo. Kung paano ito. Anyway. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, my topic today is Imperial Manila is actually U.S. imperialism. When I was assigned in Washington, D.C. as a Philippine diplomat in 1986 to 93, I often started my speeches before white Anglo-Saxon audiences with a brief introduction that I come from the Philippines, whose history meant almost 400 years confined in a convent life around Spanish friars, 40 years indoctrination to Hollywood under the Americans, and 4 years of accidental sashimi under the Japanese. Why accidental? Why accidental? Because if the Americans were not here, I doubt if there would have been any casualties among Filipinos. But the U.S. State Department has summarized our ignominious handshake. After its defeat in the Spanish-American War of 1898, Spain ceded its long-standing colony of the Philippines to the United States in the Treaty of Paris. And on February 4, 1899, just 2 days before the U.S. Senate ratified the Treaty of Paris, fighting broke up between the American forces and the Filipino nationalists led by Emilio Aguinaldo, who sought independence rather than a change in colonial rulers. The ensuing Philippine-American War lasted 3 years and resulted in the death of over 4,200 Americans and over 20,000 Filipino combatants. Where the disagreement in casualties came about was in how many Filipino civilians died from violence, famine, and disease because of the war. The U.S. estimates 200,000, but the 1901 statement of General Franklin Bell that the Americans have killed at least 600,000 Filipinos. A participant in the 1981 New York Review of Books, however, corroborated that figure, close to that figure, to as much as 700,000 if one uses the population estimate in 1898 provided in the census of 1903. The Philippine population then was 6.5 million. So the subsequent death toll would amount to 10% of the population, which could very well qualify for genocidal proportions. The most heavily affected was southern Philippines, notably Baranginga in Samar, and Budaho and Budbagsak in Jolo. But the genocidal manifestation of American imperialism is more than slaying the body, but more of captivating the human spirit. It is so insidious. U.S. imperialism has become reflexive for most Filipinos under what we call colonial mentality. In the discussion of Imperial Manila, my first reference is from Ambassador Rigoberto Tiglao's column at the Manila Times. Quote, National Security Advisor Eduardo Año's bannered screaming statement by several media outlets, any secession move to be met with force. Not to be outdone, Defense Secretary Gilbert Teodoro said the military will use its forces to quell and stop any and all attempts to dismember the Republic. Tiglao said it is these two officials blabbering that should be quelled. Kakahiya naman si Teodoro. A few days after AFP spokesperson Andulong said that the Department of Defense never meant the use of violence. They just ate their words. According to Tiglao, they were brainlessly reacting to former President Rodrigo Duterte's statements at a sparsely amended, little reported press conference in Davao City last week about regrouping Mindanao leaders to push for what has been called the Mindanao Initiative. I was in Davao at both Maisog Leaders Forum and the People's Prayer Rally, and I did not hear any secessionist statements, which goes for this administration's propensity to entertain Mariteses and Marisols in its government. What Duterte invoked was that if conditional move, the president continues on his addiction to prohibited drugs remains hostage to American demands, prioritize on polarizing politics in their quest to perpetuate his family in power, and manipulating constitutional amendments, tolerate corruption at high places, and continuously neglect the needs of the many who are poor, especially the people of Mindanao, then it would make sense for Mindanao to just separate from the Philippines. Marcos's People's Initiative, Marcos's and Romualdez's People's Initiative will be met, therefore, with a Mindanao Initiative. That is the logical conclusion, which will be done in observance of internal and international laws and procedures. Ang ginagawa niyang Philippine Communications Office na yan, dapat palta na yan from PCO to PMO. Ha?
Misinformation.
Powerful Miscommunication Office. Ay. Another columnist, Rod Kapunan, attacks a different perspective. The issues, he says, that have driven the infinitely graver call for the exploration of a Mindanao independence is the direct physical threat with the insidious flirtation of the Marcos Jr.'s administration as regards the arrest of former Rodrigo Duterte by the U.S.-controlled International Criminal Court, the subsequent inclusion of Vice President Duterte in the charge of human rights violation in connections with the anti-drug war. He was referring to Bongbong's Marcos volte-face. Quote, after really too much dilly-dallying, Marcos declared ICC had no jurisdiction in the Philippines as the country had withdrawn from ICC's Rome Statute in March 2018. But he expressed, talk about double speak, politically sensitive. They are welcome to the ICC. Visitors threatening the most popular president, Philippine ex-president in living memory. Did Marcos and his cousin Martin Romualdez, can they not see through this cheap trick? Balita ko, advisor nila si Ronnie Puno, President Marcos's chief of black operations during the time of Marcos Sr. The president's net approval rating has plummeted down from 80 to 65 to 47 last December. Not because of the Dutertes, of anything that Duterte has been doing, or Sara, but out of the weight of their own broken promises and non-achievement. In fact, to prove a point, Sara's rating is now 14 points higher than Marcos's at 61. Kapunan added that really seated the Dutertes in the huge following all over the country of the much missed tough anti-drug president. The attacks on the Dutertes are part of a U.S. strategic political plan to continue its control of the Philippines through its traditional political elite and oligarchs, if I may add, that it has co-opted, and the independent-minded Dutertes are definitely prime targets whom the U.S. is determined to eliminate from future politics of the country. It is the same as the U.S. elimination of Marcos Sr. from Philippine politics, which the progeny has clearly parlayed away with. Let me illustrate. The broader implication of the recolonization of the Philippines is the systemic and systematic dismantling of any national economic development plan. According to Jaime Marcos, walang budget ang infrastructure program, mga projects natin for this year. So how can Marcos drive the country at 100 kilometers per hour when the handbrake is up and held by the Americans? And one of the earliest victims to this is the extremely vital 10-phase, 1,544-kilometer-long Mindanao Circumferential Railway, approved to be funded by a multi-billion-dollar official development assistance from China. During Duterte's term, you would remember that China funded Samal Davao Bridge and the Bukana Bridge project, which recently commenced construction. And there is a report that Marcos wants this Mindanao Railway to be rebided to an American wannabe. Not only have the Chinese the best train technology in the world today, but it was the Chinese who built the first railway in the U.S. U.S. rail making technology is way behind. They're not even in the top 10 in the world. So what is this? Another fundraising campaign for the other side of Malacanang? The Mindanao Independence Movement sentiment is not just about the Dutertes. It is about the entire development strategy of the nation, which the U.S. continues to block as they try their darndest during the time of Marcos Sr. and succeeding in sabotaging his 11 industrial projects just before they finally ousted him with the controlled puppet Corazon Aquino. And the rest is a 30-year history of dismantling the Philippine independent economy and its mantra of liberalization, deregulation, and privatization. For 6 years under Duterte, Kapunan said, the Philippines saw a revival of Marcos Sr. independence in foreign policy and the revival of a national physical economy development of public and industrial infrastructure development and building spree. But U.S. imperialism has been restored and Manila's diktats now follow that strategy of oppression, suppression, and the construction of development initiatives and projects. Let me illustrate that to you, my dear audience, in terms of numbers. In the last full year of Noynoy Aquino, Chinese tourists that came to the Philippines were 360,000. That was 2015. In only 3 years, Duterte was able to increase that to 900,000, 3 times. And another year, in 2019, it settled at 1.7 million. From 360,000 to 1.7 million. Ladies and gentlemen, last year, the Chinese tourists that came into the Philippines was less than Noynoy Aquino's number. They didn't even make 300,000. Lahat ng butas na matatakpan ng Amerikano para magkaroon ng dialogo ang Pilipinas at China, tinatakpan nila. Kaya ang ginagawa nila. Tinadivert tayo dyan sa cat and mouse sa South China Sea. So I go to my third columnist who wrote in the Manila Times, as we take its side, the U.S. is losing global clout. After 2 years of war and devastation for Ukraine and economic fallout in the world, 500,000 dead, Kiev's army nearing collapse, and tens of millions of Ukrainians displaced and mostly driven abroad, Russia is stronger militarily and economically. Its 750,000 troops in and around Ukraine are the most powerful in Europe. The Russian economy has overridden Germany to become the number 5 in the world based on a World Bank calculation boosted by petroleum revenues and defense spending. Saludo is convinced that if Washington is seen as compromising the interests of its allies, they would have less reason to follow its leadership. And if that happens in Europe, its paramount bailiwick, it is even more so elsewhere. Quote, which brings us the second new development eroding U.S. clout is Israel's looming attack on Rafah. Ayan, mga kabansa. Huh? At nagpakita na dyan ng objection ang Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, among others. But Netanyahu is determined to proceed, however, urging that 4 Hamas battalions in Rafah cannot be left there. He has ordered the array to evacuate 1 million people from potential war zones, but that won't keep the mounting body count now topping 28,000, mostly women and children, as Gaza health authorities report. Saludo stressed that when the UN General Assembly voted twice in October for humanitarian ceasefire, the U.S. joined Israel in the small and dwindling minority of nations voting no. The ICJ has issued an initial ruling on South Africa's suit alleging genocide by Israel in Gaza, calling for action to prevent genocide. Washington, however, will probably never accept a genocide ruling to avoid having to take action against Israel as U.S. law requires for genocidal acts. Bottom line, sabi ni Saludo, America's support for Israel is alienating most nations of Asia and Africa, including Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. So while the Philippines is becoming a U.S. military platform, in Asia, the rest of ASEAN has not followed Washington's lead in building a regional alliance to counter China. Saludo, a former cabinet member during Gloria Arroyo's presidency, noted that the third development eroding Washington's global clout is BRICS. BRICS, standing for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. The global economic grouping led by these countries. The top BRICS initiative is the expansion of trade and financial flows bypassing the dominant US dollar-based international monetary system. The de-dollarization push got a boost with the West financial sanctions on Russia, shutting out its banks from the SWIFT international payments network used for most financial transactions, plus freezing of Russian assets held by foreign banks. That led dozens of nations to join BRICS as a fallback in case of economic backfire. Also driving the shift to non-dollar assets and transaction is the greenbacks, repeated volatility whenever the U.S. federal government debt nears the legally mandated borrowing limit fought over by rival Republicans and Democrats in Congress. In recent years, central banks have increased gold holdings and shipped bullion home instead of keeping them in Western banks. The light at the end of the imperialist tunnel is definitely the BRICS way. But will our president come to that logical conclusion? This is why Duterte is adding fire to his belly. A close confidant of the president and an appointed advisor came strongly against my often constructive criticisms of how the president has become slow and incoherent in policy making. One well-known turnaround was sacrificing 23 billion of development grants. Billion yan, hindi million. Assistance and loans from Xi Jinping in exchange for a measly 82 million in U.S. pledges to support 4 additional EDCA bases. Hindi pa yata nakakarating yung kalahati. Tapos na ang 2023. But what looked ridiculous to me was surprisingly not to him. According to this advisor, the U.S. caught the president in one of his moments of paranoia and threatened to replace him if he would not agree to fall under U.S. diktats. So just as they removed his father from power. On the other hand, if he played the American card, the U.S. would guarantee he stays in power as long as he wants. You see? That will explain the People's Initiative. The People's Initiative is made in Washington, D.C. So he said, he cannot do anything except to pivot to the U.S. and balance his relations with China. I found this surrealistic because what he seems to be saying is precisely what Ron Kapunan explained earlier. An independent foreign policy would be to use the national interest of the people as fulcrum in balancing relations with China and the U.S., just as Duterte did. What President Marcos has been doing is use the U.S. as the fulcrum in regulating our relations with China to the sacrifice of our national interests on the other end. What happened to the proverbial seesaw? Our progress with China is way lower than that during the Benigno Aquino administration. Our most urgent interest is suffering under high inflation due to the lack of new money, whether internally generated or foreign invested. We have no industries to start with. We are a unique economy that went from agricultural economy straight to a service economy without industrialization, because the Americans blocked the 11 industrialization projects of Marcos Sr. The Americans continue to run our country through the ruling oligarchies, who is in bed with the president not just as cronies, but in unmitigated greed. So in conclusion, I would ask, was it John Kennedy, an American, who said that those who rode the back of the tiger ends up inside the tiger? This Marcos appears to be following the footsteps of his father, all the way to the belly of the hegemon. Thank you and good morning.
Thank you, Kaado Paglinawan, for reminding us what the true national interest of the Philippines is and how it should be pursued. Now I'd like to move on to my presentation on Philippines-Russia relations. My presentation today is entitled Russia, a Friend to the Philippines. Please. What compelled me to deliver is a few days ago or last week, Philippine Coast Guard Commodore J. Tariela issued a statement where he was discussing, the various South China Sea developments, but then he added Russia into the picture. He says here, quote, "Without such exposure," he's referring to what was discussed earlier, the maritime assertive transparency of the U.S. ex-Navy Colonel Raymond Powell, the Project Mushu. "Without such exposure, smaller nations like the Philippines will continue to be targets of so-called bullying by more powerful and larger countries like China. If we do not expose their illegal actions, countries like China and Russia will become increasingly emboldened to, quote, bully smaller nations, knowing that they will face no consequences or accountability. Their unlawful actions will go unpunished if like-minded states that support there's this phrase again, the international rules-based order remain unaware," end quote. There are three things to note here. First, does the Russian embassy in the Philippines know that they are now considered an enemy by seemingly the Philippine government because of this official? Last I checked, he is not the architect of Philippine foreign policy, but the president. This is way out of line. Second thing is, I would understand if he talked about bigger nations bullying smaller nations, and he mentioned the two countries. But the problem here is that he omitted, in the minds of the Global South, people of the Global South, who the real bullies are. That is the United States of America and Israel. Those are the countries which the Global South and Asia view as a powerful country bullying smaller countries, namely Palestine, and now with the new Yemen issue. It's understandable that he would bring up China because, China is a claimant state in the South China Sea, particularly the Spratlys, as well as Vietnam and Malaysia and Taiwan. However, what is the purpose of antagonizing Russia other than to get support or please the Americans? Then he talks about the international rules-based order. Yet you fail to mention the United States and Israel. The United States, who lied about weapons of mass destruction to go to war in Iraq, killing millions, bombing the Middle East for 30 years without international support, bypassing the United Nations, as well as Israel, who is the most condemned country in the United Nations. Most of the United Nations General Assembly resolutions single out or condemn Israel. Yet those two countries are not mentioned in his description of bigger, powerful and larger countries bullying smaller countries. Next slide, please. Now, here are some questions I'd like to ask. This is from Commodore Tariela's LinkedIn page. He says here, quote, "I am incredibly grateful to the East-West Center for granting me the opportunity to pursue my U.S.-Philippines Alliance Fellowship. Even though I will only have a 2-week window to conduct my research, this is a remarkable chance for me to connect with key government officials and policy experts in Washington who are ardent supporters of the Philippines Government Transparency Initiative, the Project Mushu, which is an American project pursuing American interests and not Philippine interests. To borrow a phrase from Senator Amy Marcos, Raymond Powell is a threatening foreign meddler who has no place in our country and he should leave. The United States is not a claimant state in the Spratlys in the South China Sea. They have no business intervening in a dispute which Asians can resolve amongst themselves. Now, the East-West Center, from where Commodore Tariela conducted his 2-week research, received according to this report, in 2005, received a total of $37 million, including $19 million from the U.S. Congress. The U.S. government is funding this center, this school or place of learning where he participated in. Okay. Now, this is also the same Commodore Tariela who has called people who have expressed a different view, the non-pro-American view of the South China Sea dispute, as traitors. We have free speech in this country. We can disagree with the government's domestic policy as well as their foreign policy, and they should not be subjected to a witch hunt. They should not be really bullied or intimidated by this person who is usurping his authority. Every time I see this person in the media, he's always referred to as Philippine Coast Guard spokesperson. But he is not the overall spokesperson of the Coast Guard. He is only a spokesperson of the National Task Force for West Philippine Sea, interagency, not the entire Coast Guard. But he is represented by the media as the final voice. And this is a big mistake because with statements like these, antagonizing Russia, going after dissent or disagreement over the South China Sea dispute, you are, as Ambassador Tiglao said, you are turning the Coast Guard into a laughing stock. Next slide, please. Right. As I mentioned earlier, the real bully, and if we want to be fair, let's include them. Let's not just single them out. The Israel and the United States. So far, 28,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza. 12,000 children have been killed. Yet no mention from Commodore Tariela about this country, being a larger and powerful country bullying smaller countries. Again, the United States in this United Nations Security Council was the only permanent member. If you're not aware, the United Nations Security Council is the only body in the United Nations where votes are really binding and matter. In the US Security Council, the US was the only permanent member to vote against a ceasefire. Stop the killing, stop the bombs, stop the deaths. This continues to go on. Those are the latest numbers. 28,000 Palestinians are killed in Gaza. And as Kado mentioned earlier, this column from Ricardo Saludo, Israel is bombing refugee centers. Gaza is a nation. Gaza has 2 million children living there. 2 million people living there. Half of them children. 1 million people have fled, and they're bombing. Israel is bombing the safe havens, supposedly. This is not. It's not an example that you thought was worthy to mention of a powerful, larger country bullying a smaller country, Palestine. Next slide, please. Even in the United States, there are senators who are criticizing the fact that the Americans, the United States, are the ones funding and arming, enabling and supporting this genocide, this murder of innocent civilians and children in Palestine. This is an example of a powerful, larger country bullying a smaller country. And back in December, at the end of the year, the United States of America approves emergency sale of weapons to Israel, bypassing Congress, to kill more Palestinian children. It's this, I hate to keep repeating myself, but this is a sin of omission to not mention these two countries when you're talking about bullies. Next slide, please. Is this an example of a country following the so-called rules-based international order? I have a list here of US interventions since World War II, bomb attacks, sabotage, and removal of democratically elected governments. For the only reason that they've disobeyed the United States' demands. The Philippines there also is also there. It should be 1986, counting the EDSA one, but here's the list. And I'd like to quote US President Jimmy Carter. There. Philippines, 1989. Former US President Jimmy Carter says, quote, "We're supposed to be a Christian nation, are we not? But we are known throughout the world as the most warlike country on earth, and I would say almost all the wars in which we've been involved have been unnecessary." Even President Donald Trump said they wasted $6 trillion on nothing in the Middle East for fake weapons of mass destruction, and that created ISIS and terrorism, which we experience here in Marawi, in Mindanao. So who's really the bully here, and who's really not following the international rules-based order? Next slide, please. All right. So the title of my presentation is that I'm trying to demonstrate how Russia is a friend to the Philippines. And what is our national interest? According to Pulse Asia surveys, 70 to 80% of the Filipino people, they say that inflation and high price of goods, electricity, oil prices are the most urgent problem in this country. We see this last week, a few days ago, endless oil price hikes. The price of gas is going up, with no end in sight. So how can this urgent problem that the Filipinos are actually experiencing be remedied and solved through a more closer and strategic partnership with Russia? Next slide, please. After the elections in May 2022, when President-elect Bongbong Marcos won the election, he met with the Russian ambassador, Marat Pavlov, and he said Russia is ready to help the Philippines on their energy needs. June 13, 2022, His Excellency Marat Pavlov, Russian ambassador to the Philippines, said, quote, "In this turbulent period, Russia is ready to cooperate with the Philippines under the Marcos presidency and to extend help to the Filipino people's needs for affordable energy. we agreed to continue our discussion further. I've even heard some discussions that Russia is willing to offer 20%, 30% discount for gas. Now, if we have cheaper gas, that would mean lower transportation costs. That would mean lower prices for goods. Everything. It all trickles down. The low price of gas, everything, all the prices of goods will collapse as well. Next slide, please. Now, it has been 400, almost 500 days since this statement from President Marcos Jr., September 24, 2022, more than a year already, where he said, quote, "We need to approach Russia. They can provide us with some fuel. We need to find those new sources of fuel, feed, fertilizer that are just critical for us." And he was asked, by the way, this interview was on American soil by Bloomberg. And he was asked by the interviewer, what about the sanctions, the American sanctions, as a result of the war in Ukraine? Sanctions are a ban or a penalty on nations. If you do business with this country or this individual, you get punished or you get fined, etc. Or you're not allowed to travel to this country or that country. So President Marcos was asked about the sanctions of the United States. Will we get punished if we buy this cheap oil from Russia? He said, the political side has been tricky, but nonetheless, national interest comes first. Who is Commodore J. Tariel to speak for national interests and antagonize Russia when his boss, the commander-in-chief, is being a friend to Russia and Russia is being a friend to us? Whose interest do you really serve? Because the interest that most in the minds, the national interest of the minds of most people is to lower the price of gas. And Russia and the president want to cooperate to make that happen. And you're over here, Commodore Tariela, sabotaging that and antagonizing Russia. For what purpose? Please the Americans? To please Colonel Raymond Powell? Is that the reason? I'm merely asking questions here. Next slide, please. It's not just the Americans who are against this purchase of cheap Russian gas. If we buy the cheap Russian gas, we will have more supply of gas, and as a result, the price of gas will go down. It's not just the Americans who are objecting to this plan of the president and of the Republic of the Philippines to purchase cheap Russian gas for the people. The oligarchs, as mentioned earlier by Commenton Kaado, Manny Pangilinan, the main saboteur, the Salim Group, Forum Energy, majority owners are Americans, sabotage this plan, this cheap oil purchase plan. Makati on October 10, 2022, a few weeks after the president made the announcement, Makati Business Club Executive Director Francisco Makati Business Club Executive Director Francisco regardless, on Junior said the government must consider Francisco Coco Alcuas said the government must consider the long-term impact of buying Russian oil. So the oligarchs and the Americans are against the president and the Republic of the Philippines plan to buy cheap oil so that the Philippines can develop and give them a more comfortable life and ease their expenditures. Please zoom out. Yeah, so the Americans, the United States of America, March 8, 2022, they banned imports of Russian oil, liquefied natural gas, and coal. Now, I'm a Filipino. We're all Filipinos. Russia is an enemy of the Americans because of the Ukraine, war. But Russia is not my enemy. They're not the enemy of the Filipino people, and they're certainly not the enemy of this government. They are the enemy of the United States. The enemies of the United States are not necessarily and are not the enemies of the Filipino people. And last year in December, the United States imposed penalties, sanctions on more than 250 people and entities in connection with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, including people in China, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, And the United States says the new sanctions penalties target individuals and entities who have furthered Russia's ability to wage war against Ukraine and are bolstering Russia's future energy production. Next slide, please. Now, the common refrain we hear from people who object to buying from the Philippines, from various politicians and the commentators, why they object to buying cheap Russian gas is because they always bring up this quote from the Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel, where he said, neutrality enables the oppressor. So the logic goes like this. You buy cheap oil from Russia, we are giving them money, and that money that we paid for their cheap gas is funding the war in Ukraine. That we are somehow funding the debts in Ukraine. This is the logic of these pro-American envoys, anti-Russian forces, etc. Now, for those who use the term enabler to describe the president and people like us who support this purchase of cheap Russian gas, would they also call Ukraine an enabler of Russia's war? Because even Ukraine, despite the war, they are still allowing Russian gas to flow through its territory, right? So when Commodore Tariela is saying we should support the international rules-based order, seems to me that when we're talking about the 2016 arbitration or when we're talking about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we're always referring to the West. We're not referring to the global South. We're not referring to the developing countries. We're always referring to the West. This kind of colonial mentality has no place in this new multipolar new world. In fact, to my right here, you will see the countries that have imposed sanctions or penalties on Russia because of the Ukraine war. Less than 16% of the world's population live in countries which have voted to issue penalties and sanctions on Russia. Less than 16%. So 84% of the people living in the world are not supporting this anti-Russia crusade in the United Nations. So what kind of international rules-based order are you talking about? Right? Next, please. Now, our counterparts from the Strat base, particularly Richard Haydarian, they like to use this leverage theory, right? They say the EDCA bases are a leverage against alleged Chinese aggression in the South China Sea and Strat base. But I've never heard anyone make this point, so I'll make this point. People fear that if President Marcos and the Republic of the Philippines pursues this plan to buy cheap Russian gas, that we will be subjected to the same sanctions and penalties from the United States for doing business with Russia, commerce, buying this cheap oil. I dare, if I were in charge, if I had leadership, if I was President Marcos, I would dare the United States to threaten. If I was President Marcos, I would purchase the cheap Russian gas and then threaten the United States to terminate the EDCA bases and the Mutual Defense Treaty if they even consider sanctioning us. The Philippines is an independent, sovereign country. This is how you truly pursue an independent foreign policy. You pursue your national interest, not the national interest of the Americans. Russia is not our enemy. They are America's enemies, but not our enemy. Always remember that. That is true leverage. That's how this is how you pursue statecraft. The Americans threaten to sanction us because we bought cheap Russian oil to help our people and our commuters and our jeepney drivers and taxi drivers. We threaten, and we actually do terminate the EDCA bases to show that we are truly an independent nation, not a colonial subject of the United States. Next slide, please. Right. So this is an article from the American New York Times. The title is How India Profits from Its Neutrality in the Ukraine War. Right? Seaborne imports of Russian oil have increased. Indian imports of Russian oil have increased millions of barrels per day. So millions of barrels per day, as well as Russia, as well as China, Saudi Arabia. Even Saudi Arabia, who is an oil exporting country. They're importing record oil from Russia. June last year, 2023, 910,000 metric tons of oil imported. Saudi Arabia is imported from Russia. These are countries who are smart and are thinking and pursue their national interests first, and not the military objectives of the Americans. Next slide, please. Now, here's an example of a fellow Asian country who's benefiting from a strategic partnership and friendship with Russia. Here is Bangladesh. Bangladesh have agreed to use yuan, the Chinese currency, to settle their payment because Bangladesh is seeking Russia's help in building 2 nuclear power plants in collaboration with Russia's state-owned company in a $12 billion project. 90% is financed through a loan payable in 28 years, right? And last October, Bangladesh has received its first uranium shipment from Russia for its Russia-built nuclear power plant. My question to you is, how's our nuclear plant doing? Is it open? It's been built since 1970s. It was never open. We're not benefiting from this. The Americans and the oligarchs benefit from the Philippines being a stagnant country that's not developing. But look at Bangladesh. Look at some of your clothes and products that you have. Made in Bangladesh. When are we going to see things made in the Philippines? Right? Number one deterrent, number one reason why investors are not coming to the Philippines is because of our expensive electricity. If we pursue this nuclear energy path, we would have lower prices of electricity and more investors will come in and will become, this will generate trillions of economic benefit to the Philippines, and we can even be an oil exporting country now, no longer dependent. Next slide, please. Now, Kamentong asked me to cover this part wherein we revive the old statement of President Bongbong Marcos, which he seemingly has abandoned with the announcement of the purchase of submarines, BrahMos Indian missiles, etc., for defense buildup. During the administration of President Duterte, under, I believe, Defense Secretary Lorenzana, terminated during the administration of President Duterte. It terminated the 12.7 billion peso helicopter purchase in fear of Russian sanctions. In fairness, this was, in fairness to President Duterte, many of his appointees and appointments sabotaged him. I do not blame this on the former president, just like how I don't blame the former president because it was his Foreign Affairs Secretary Teddy Boy Locsin who terminated unilaterally the joint oil exploration. So I don't blame him for this. So 12.7 billion peso helicopter purchase was canceled under the Duterte administration in fear of American sanctions and penalties as a result of the Ukraine war. Slide, please. That is why I say, in fairness, this is not really a big concern for me because the current president, President Bongbong Marcos, has said that there is no point for the Philippines to build up its armory. Helicopters, missiles, submarines are not conducive to a post-pandemic economic recovery that the president ran on, President Marcos Jr. ran on. He said in January 2023, quote, I think to an extent, the belief is that, first of all, there is no point in the Philippines building up its armory. More importantly, perhaps, is our abiding belief that the solutions are not going to be military. So I am not as concerned with the termination of the Russian helicopter deal because that will not feed anyone. But what will feed people and will benefit people immediately, tangible, is the purchase of the cheap Russian gas, and I think that should be pursued. Next slide. Okay, so again, I'd like to always point out, since Commodore Tariela talked about the rules-based order, just like in the South China Sea, we always hear one narrative that it is. We always start from the middle of the story, right? China is building artificial islands in the South China Sea, but they never tell you that China has occupied 7 reefs in the Spratlys since 1998, and only when the Philippines ended one-on-one bilateral talks with China and pursued an illegal, null and void, non-binding arbitration case, that China built artificial islands. The same way, Russia did not invade Ukraine because one day, just like former Senator Ping Lacson says, it's just because they wanted to. No, there's a complete story to this. The Americans promised not to expand NATO. And what is NATO? NATO is this military alliance with the United States and Europe for defense. It was created to fight against the Soviet Union, the perceived communist threat. But the Soviet Union no longer exists. There's no more communist, expansion, etc. And even former US President Donald Trump has said NATO is obsolete because the Soviet Union no longer exists. And so NATO, the Americans said that they will not expand NATO, the American military alliance, to deter the Soviet Union, which is modern day Russia. They said they will not expand NATO. And yet, in 30 years, they've expanded to 19 countries. And they've been provoking Ukraine. You see that picture, the cartoon on the right. The narrative is that Ukraine is just this helpless victim. Jack Tariela says, smaller country being bullied by the bear, the Russian country. That's not the case. They were provoked Russia has been provoked by the United States through its puppet Ukraine, the Ukrainian government, and that's what led to their invasion. Of course, 2 wrongs don't make a right, but it is necessary for us to understand the complete picture of what really happened. Next slide, please. Now, why did NATO expansion lead to Russia, President Putin invading Ukraine? Because under NATO, if one member nation is attacked, all member nations will come to their defense. Now, this is unacceptable because Russia is an adversary of the United States. And look at this picture here. US NATO military bases surrounding Moscow, surrounding Russia. It's like if I had an enemy, if I had an enemy and then I befriend all of his neighbors and then I put missiles and rockets pointed at him. If you enhance the security of one country, you cannot enhance the security of one country without the other country responding in proportion to. All right. And even the Pope Francis has said NATO caused Russia's invasion of Ukraine. You keep expanding into Russia's borders, putting weapons pointing directly at them. Well, Russia's going to respond. You're putting them in a defensive position. Same thing is happening in the South China Sea. Former vice presidential candidate Walden Bello said that what is driving China's behavior in the South China Sea is the fear of military encirclement, just like what you see here with Russia. Fear of US military encroachment or encirclement. That's what China fears. That's why that is what is driving their behavior in the South China Sea. Because people are acting in self-defense by what you have provoked them to do. Right? All right, next slide, please. All right, so President Marcos Jr. has a great opportunity to pursue or continue to get the cheap Russian gas from because he is neutral on the matter. He said, there is no need to take a stand. We are not involved except our nationals, our OFWs. And that's the right thing to do, that you prioritize your people first. But the dispute between 2 countries, thousands of miles away, is none of your business, right? Please go back. So when President Marcos Jr. was asked whether the Philippine government supports Ukraine's peace plan, he said, that's not for us to decide. Those details are between Ukraine and Russia. They should talk it out. Again, emphasizing one-on-one bilateral negotiations. How they handle the territories is clearly between the two countries. Let us remember the disrespect by the Ukrainians. You know, the Russians and the Ukrainians have a war, but yet they want to drag the entire world seemingly. Ukraine wants to drag the entire world seemingly to support their cause, which have nothing to do with us. We didn't start the war. So the Ukrainian ambassador last year was complaining through the media that they were bothering and they kept calling Malacanang for months to discuss the war in Ukraine. I don't know. Some friend told me that every time he sees Ukrainian President Zelensky, he's seemingly always begging for more money, begging for more weapons, begging for more aid, etc. And no response for 6 months, June 2022 until January 2023, from during the first few months of the Marcos administration. Remember the disrespect offered to us by Ukraine. Next slide, please. Yeah, and in fact, the DFA, next slide, please. Yeah, in fact, the DFA, Undersecretary Soreta said last year, he was objecting, or he was not happy with the way that Ukraine was handling the matter. In fact, he said, Ukraine is a country we have a good relationship with, but when matters like these are vented by representatives, it's not something we appreciate. Russia has done nothing but to befriend us and to offer a hand to help the Philippines and the people in Ukraine. I'm sorry, but last year they really disrespected us, according to the government. Next slide, please. So to end my presentation here, I just have one simple message. Fast track the purchase of cheap Russian gas, cheap Russian oil, so that we have lower gas prices for Filipinos, so we ease their expenditure prices. And I think the president still has a chance to pursue this and end this hardship of endless oil price hikes in the country, seemingly every other week. Thank you very much. All right. If we have any questions for all of us, please, I'd like to read them and we'd like to answer them on Zoom, Facebook, or YouTube. China never colonized countries, only USA, Europe do. That's true. Thank you, Rosary Around the World, for that observation. That is true. Look at Africans, they said to US, Europe, they are not beggars, only Philippines. Africans stand up to USA, Europe. True. Oh, somebody has a question here. Can you believe that for the 20% discount on Russian gas and it will boil down to merchandise? Morning, everyone. Do we have any questions in Zoom or the Facebook Live? Right. Great viewership today. Thank you for all of our viewers who are tuning in the Facebook and YouTube Live and joining us in Zoom, and will join us later in the replay. Release the Israeli hostages, of course. Good morning. Let us inform. Any questions in the Zoom? Please send your questions in. We have time to read them. Okay. Oh, Somebody asks, is this part of the depopulation agenda? Absolutely. I mean, it's a genocide happening in Gaza with Israel. It's a nation of children. It's a nation of children. Half of them living in Gaza are children, and they're bombing and killing them. Quote, is there any defined Philippine foreign policy? We're supposed to be a non-aligned neutral country. I'd like to give Kaado to answer this.
Yes, we are signatory to the ASEAN non-alignment treaty, as well as the ASEAN non-nuclear proliferation treaty. Is there any defined foreign policy? Well, right now, we do not see any pronouncements coming from the president as to his stand over the issues that confront the country. What we hear are too many voices. It was only on December 19 in Japan when we finally heard the president's ask for a paradigm shift. This is after 10.5 months of Philippine provocations in the resupply mission to Ayungin Shoal and other parts of the South China Sea, particularly the Spratly Islands, where we also have claimed islands. So right now, the answer to this question is basically, I think our foreign policy has no definite direction. It is highly subjective. For instance, the preceding protocols and agreements involving resupply mission to Ayungin Shoal was standing not only through the very toxic relationship between China and the Philippines during the time of Noynoy Aquino, the Secretary of National Defense, Voltaire Gasmin, admitted that there was an agreement as to how the resupply mission to Ayungin Shoal with the BRP Sierra Madre was to be conducted. More so during the time of Duterte, because hardly were there any actual serious provocations during the time of Duterte. But I think the relationship there finally met its climax when the president himself surfaced and said that he was not aware of any agreements involving the BRP Sierra Madre. And worse, he added that if there were any, then he was rescinding it. So that is the answer to your question. At that point, the president rescinded the protocols, and that is his foreign policy. Now, as to why he did that is still a perplexing question up to now. It was only on December 19 when he asked for the paradigm shift when he was on his trip to Japan. Kasi 10.5 months na. Walang nangyayari sa South China Sea, kundi near collisions. The Chinese in its law enforcement had to already escalate to the use of dazzling lasers, water cannons, and acoustic weapons. That obviously the Philippine Coast Guard does not know are part of the non-lethal weapons, NLWs, that are authorized by 5 Geneva Conventions. And in fact, is part of the manual of the U.S. Department of Defense. And many more. Hindi lang yung tatlong yan. No? There are many more weapons classified under non-lethal weapons. Ano yung non-lethal? Yung hindi nakakamatay. My first encounter with a non-lethal weapon used at law enforcement was on January, was that January 29 or 28, 1970? When a Metrocom water cannon was aimed at us, and we had to seize control. We had to go there and mount the Metrocom vehicle itself and get control of it. And what we did with it was ram the vehicle into the gate 4 of Malacanang in order to stop the water cannoning. That was, you see, as early as 1970, alam ko na non-lethal weapon yan. Bakit hindi alam ng Coast Guard yan? And it was only after we have lectured the Coast Guard, the Philippine Navy, and the Armed Forces of the Philippines on the existing of international anti-collision regulations law. Paulit-ulit namin, inuulit dito yan sa forum. Ngayon lang sila, from the mouths of Tariela. Now he is the one saying and accusing China of call regs violations. But he cannot explain why a Coast Guard ship, what the Coast Guard ship Teresa Magbanwa was in the first place doing at the Scarborough Shoal. So ngayon lamang bumalik tayo to our senses because by December 20, nag-request ng telephone conversation si Enrique Manalo with Wang Yi, his counterpart in China. And so they called for the 8th bilateral consultative mechanism talks. And to this day, the 8th BCM is still in effect. And while it's still in effect, tuloy-tuloy ang mga megaphone announcements ni Tariela, tuloy-tuloy ang mga megaphone pronouncements ni Browner, tuloy-tuloy ang megaphone announcements ni Bocciodoro. At itutuloy daw nila itong assertive transparency. I have not heard anything from the President about any order to continue the assertive policy. Why? Because if you once again allowed, Mr. President, itong, hayaan mo na mawala ng trabaho si Tariela at saka si Raymond Powell. Bakit? Once magsimula na naman yan, you will be back to December 18 when you yourself got confused kung ano na nangyayari dyan na hindi naman bumababa ang tension. Ano ba talaga ang gusto mo mangyari? So gusto rin namin malaman. No? But so far, we support the DFA's 8th bilateral consultative mechanism. And this is the only way. It is only through the negotiation table. It is only through bilateral negotiations, that we can enjoy anything in the South China Sea. We have to make our intentions clear. We have to make our laws stick. Kulang-kulang tayo ng laws eh. Yung West Philippine Sea na sinasabi nyo, you consider that a foreign policy? Then if you want that to be a foreign policy, enact a law, because that is only on the weight of an administrative order of the president. So, there you go. Let us put our act together first. If I were the president, I will ask for a review of the arbitral ruling. Does it really favor the Philippines? Kasi ang daming butas na ng arbitral ruling na yan. That even former Justice Antonio Carpio has changed his mind. He is now against the militarization of Ayungin Shoal kasi he realized that if Ayungin Shoal remains to be militarized, hindi pwede magkaroon ng exclusive economic zone dyan. Paano mangingisda ang mga fishermen dyan? Kung may gera-gera dyan. O kung may mga haraharangan dyan. Kasi ang problema, kung walang pinagbabasihang batas, wala na rin common sense ang ating mga opisyales. So, that is the first thing I would do if I were the president. Ano ba talaga itong arbitral ruling na ito? Sinasabi nyo, victory yan. Kung victory yan, bakit nagkakagulo? And the same is true with Raymond Powell. He says that yung kanyang assertive transparency is in the same line as the arbitral ruling. Hello, Mr. Powell. You are using power. Wala kang makukumbinsi pag ganyan ang linya mo. No? So, reviewin niya na mabuti. From the very basic definition of what sovereignty is, from the very basic definition of what sovereignty rights is. Francis Tolentino has filed a bill. Ha? By law, gagawin niyang batas na lahat ng sakop ng ating 200 nautical miles ay pag-aari natin. Tingnan yung kalokohan ng mga tao yun. He is legislating a law that would amend international law. Anong klase mga senador meron tayo? Can you imagine that? That's the latest news I got this morning. Francis Tolentino has filed a bill. Ha? Na lahat doon sa 200 nautical mile limit ay pag-aari ng Pilipinas. Hello? Reviewin nyo muna ang mga terms of engagements nyo, ang mga basic definition of terms. Dahil mapapahiya lang kayo. Mas mabuti pa, huwag na kayong magbatas-batas dyan, mag-lawfare, mag-information warfare, mag-propaganda. Gumawa na lang tayo ng listahan ng mga wishlist natin from China. Submit natin sa kanila. Kasi wala tayong makukuha dyan kung walang kooperasyon. Yung nag-claim dyan na siya ang may-ari niyan. It's only when the may-ari allows us halfway. Sabi nila, they're willing to meet us halfway. What is scaring us? Iniimbita na nga tayo, they will meet us halfway. Ayaw pa natin. Masyado na tayong mga arugante. Ha? Mangmang na tayo, arugante pa tayo, wala tayong pupuntahan. Now, may prinsipyo, because it's the year of the dragon. May prinsipyo, the third foreign policy principle of China is the proud dragon repents. Ano ibig sabihin? They will always meet a small country not by the force of strength, but from the position of humility. Bakit hindi ibibigay sa atin kung anong gusto natin kung hindi naman makakasama sa kanila? When it will build peace and stability in the area. Yan ang ayaw ng China. Yung may gulo sa anywhere dyan sa kanyang soft belly. This is South China Sea. And provided we are reasonable, and this is already on record. Yung 60-40 is all about that. Deal on oil and gas. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, kaya po ako papasok ulit para masumot total po lahat ng napag-usapan natin at bigyan din ang importansya po nitong pagkakataong ito. Nagpakita na po ng pagbabago ng isip po si Presidente Bongbong Marcos. Napapatunayan natin na hindi natin pine-personal any of the issues. Kung meron tayong nakikitang senyales na may magandang gagawin na naman po ang gobyerno, pakaraan po ng isang taon, halos isang taon, isang buwan po ng eksperimento sa tinatawag ng assertive transparency. Walang ibang salita sa Tagalog po niyan kundi panggugulo na ginawa po ng Amerikano sa Project Museo po nila. Tapos na po yan. Natuto na po, mapait na leksyon ang pamahalaan po ni Bongbong Marcos na walang ibubunga po yung ginagawang proyekto ng Amerikano. Kasabot po si Tariela at ilan pong elemento ng ating national security and defense establishment. Tapos na po yan. Kaya po malakas po nating, sa boses malakas po nating sinusuportahan ang direksyon na nadesisyonan ng Malacanang at ng Department of Foreign Affairs na bumalik po sa pag-uusap at kooperasyon sa dialogo na simulan na po sa 8th bilateral consultation mechanism at ngayon pong mapapansin, kapansin-pansin po at tumatahimik, kumakalma po ang karagatan sa harap ng Ayungin Shoal at sa Scarborough Shoal, sa Recto Bank, kumakalma na naman po at yung maalon na panahon po ay lumipas na po dahil sa desisyon hindi po ng kalangitan kundi ng tao na nag-exercise ng pagkaliderato or leadership. Yan po ang hinihintay po natin at nakikita nating dahan-dahang nananambalik o bumabalik po. And so we are standing firmly behind that. We hope President Bongbong Marcos sustains this reassertion of leadership in the field of foreign relations and foreign affairs. And as we announced early this January 2024, we see the restoration of the independent foreign policy and practice this 2024. We hope the DFA will take the cue also that we are giving, that we will go all out in supporting the restoration of the independent foreign policy, which does not mean siding with one or the other, but siding with the national interest of the nation. Now that Jaime Marcos has discovered and shared with the nation that we have zero budget for infrastructure and public infrastructure development this year, we must return to our cooperation with China and return to the projects that have been already laid out from the time of Duterte to this day. The Mindanao Railway Project, the North Luzon Railway, the Southern Luzon Bicol Express, the many irrigation projects, and so on and so forth. So hindi po biro ito. Our mainstream media, which is shackled by money pangalinan, should find ways to reinsert these other news developments and isolate the sabotage and obstructionism of Manny Pangalinan's group and the Americans. So, Danny, I bring it back to you
Okay.
so that we may be able to have lunch already.
Okay. All right. Thank you everyone who have joined us this early this morning, this Friday, on our forum. Thank you to all of our speakers, Carmen Toncado and myself. And thank you to all of our viewers who join us live on YouTube, Facebook, everyone who joined us in Zoom, and everyone who will join us in the replay. Let us remember what Carmen Tong said. Let us keep up the pressure on the Philippine government to do well now that the foreign policy situation has stabilized. Let us return to the urgent concerns of the people, which is the domestic issues. Let us continue to keep up the pressure on the Philippine government, and we will give our full support if they do well. We are not personalizing this. We are dynamic. And again, Happy New Year, Happy Chinese New Year, and God bless. Thank you very much.